Hello, I'm Lauren Goodrich, and I'm joined by my colleague, Eugene Chausovsky, to talk about the state of U.S.-Russian relations. So, Eugene, this has been a very big debate within our company about where Russia and the United States not only are currently, but where they're headed. And it seemed in recent weeks that there was a series of bargains that were about to be struck between Russia and the United States, mainly because Russia seemed to have their foot on the gas pedal due to only a few months left in the Obama administration. So the first agreement that looked like it was going to be struck was some sort of agreement over Ukraine. There was the ceasefire that was struck, correct?
Right. So in the beginning of September, we saw a ceasefire deal reached between the separatists and the Ukrainian security forces. That fell apart pretty quickly, but then a couple of weeks later, we saw actually a unilateral ceasefire on the part of the separatists, which we had never seen announced. And then we started to see details trickle in of a more specific agreement over particular areas, that there would be not only a ceasefire, but actually a withdrawal of forces and weapons from that area.
And so today, Victoria Nuland, Undersecretary of State, is inside of Russia talking with the Russians about Ukraine, correct?
Yes. So Nuland went to Moscow last night, and she's there today and tomorrow. But what we've seen out of the Russians from that meeting is that they were really trying to play down any sort of a big breakthrough agreement over Ukraine. Peskov, Putin's spokesman, essentially said that this was a routine visit and that they shouldn't expect any breakthroughs. And really what we've seen on the ground reflects that reality in terms of what he said, because we've seen some tactical progress being made, but the overall situation is we still have large numbers of ceasefire violations, even those specific areas that they demarcated to pull back from, that's producing mixed results at best. So it seems like that while there is the impetus, I think, on the part of the Russians to try to get some kind of big movement on Ukraine, with these being the last months of the Obama administration, the gulf is still too big from both sides, and we're just not seeing that translate on the ground.
And we're seeing these talks separated pretty starkly from the talks over Syria. In which it seems that the United States wants to keep the Ukrainian negotiations just about Ukraine, where Russia wants to, of course, create a link between Ukraine and Syria. And currently, the United States has pretty much called off all talks with Russia over Syria in recent days. And because of this, we've seen Russia actually ramp up its operations inside of Syria in its bombing campaigns in Aleppo and supporting the loyalist forces in order for Russia to have greater leverage within Syria in hopes that possibly in the future they can relink it back to Ukraine.
Right. I think just in the same way that Russia saw a window of opportunity in Ukraine, the same situation applied to Syria, because in some ways the U.S. and Russian interests actually aligned in that they wanted to clamp down on IS and generally having the more radical militant element cooperate in terms of targeting those guys.
But we've seen all of that fall apart. And so now Russia's trying to kind of regain its leverage.
Right. And that's falling apart, I think, because just as in Ukraine, while there is some room for tactical agreements or tactical movement to be made, there's still a huge strategic gulf between the U.S. and Russia in really both of these conflicts. And I think that, the last months of the Obama administration, also from the Russian perspective, the EU sanctions, which they're trying to get lifted. The next vote will happen in January. This presented some opportunity for them to talk, but really we haven't seen that translate on the ground because there's just too many actors involved and too many differences between the players.
And so if Russia can't deal with the United States, and Russia has to get the sanctions lifted within the next year, 2 years, what are we seeing as far as Russia reaching out to the Europeans instead?
Well, the Europeans are a more pliable actor, I think, on the part of the Russians, just because in general, they have a less aggressive attitude towards Russia than the U.S. does, but also because there's 28 different countries involved, some of which have more pro-Russian relations and some of which are more aggressive. And in terms of getting those sanctions lifted, they only need one country essentially to get those sanctions lifted, because it has to be a unanimous vote. Now, up until now, those votes have led to a continuation of Russian sanctions. But that's what Russia is really trying to do, is play nice in certain areas, maybe give some tactical concessions, and hope that that the Europeans will eventually just divide themselves and get those sanctions lifted that way.
And we are seeing divisions. I mean, just over the past week, we saw UK Foreign Minister Boris Johnson come out and really try to rally the Europeans against Russia, saying that the EU could even put even more sanctions onto Russia over issues pertaining to Ukraine and Syria. However, we saw the Germans come out and be a little more tempered and say that's not on the negotiation table thus far. To where it does seem like the divisions are deep within the EU.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's certainly no certainty that the EU will ease sanctions, especially in the next vote. But that's what Russia is basically trying to maneuver around in the longer term. So maybe not in the vote in January, but perhaps the next vote in the middle of the year. Certainly Russia has reasons to get the Europeans to lift the sanctions, but they also have their own national strategic interests as well to keep intact.
Very much so. I mean, the Russians are really trying to find that balance on, they can muddle through for another year, maybe 2 years at most, with its economic pressures. However, those economic pressures are continuing to build, not as much on the Russian government as there have been some slight positive signs within the Russian economy, but for the Russian people themselves. When you have half of Russians saying that the economic crisis is just going to get deeper, you've had 25% of Russians have their salaries cut or postponed, then those are the sort of social pressures that are building on the Russian government instead of just the financial pressures within the numbers.
Yeah, absolutely. So there's a lot of things to consider, both from the Russian perspective, but also from the West, the U.S. moving forward, looking like into the next administration having to deal with this Russian problem, the EU and their own divisions to take into account. So it's going to be a complicated series of relationships, but it doesn't look like there's going to be any huge breakthroughs in the next couple of months.
Thank you, Eugene. We'll continue to watch this closely. For more on this and other topics, please go to stratfor.com.